I killed a person. After I got home, I played with the kids and toys while watching the murder news on TV. Richard said these words expressionlessly, as if he were talking about something completely ordinary. Richard was a real monster. He was a cruel sadist, a serial killer who claims to have murdered more than 200 victims. But before his crimes were exposed, everyone thought he was a good husband and a loving father. Do you liken yourself to an assassin? An interviewer once asked Richard this question. Assassin? It sounds so exotic, Richard replied with a hint of amusement and a small smile. His face then turned serious, and he said, I was just a murderer. By now, you know what I liked most was the hunt, the challenge of what the thing was. The killing for me was secondary. I got no rise as such out of it for the most part, but the figuring it out, the challenging, the stalking and doing it right successfully, that excited me a lot. The greater the odds against me, the more juice I got out of it. In 1930, Jersey City, New Jersey, a Polish man and an Irish woman formed a family. They had 4 children in total, and Richard was the second child. This serial killer's childhood was filled with pain and fear. His father was an alcoholic and abusive man with extremely unstable emotions, who frequently beat family members. His mother was a typical two-faced person. When faced with her husband, she was too timid to resist. When faced with Richard, this woman became extremely strict and often beat Richard with a broom. But for Richard, his father was a shadow he would never forget for the rest of his life. One day in 1941, Richard, almost 6 years old, witnessed his father, as if he had lost his mind, beating Richard's older brother, incessantly until the brother stopped struggling and collapsed to the ground. The young boy did not know what death this word meant. He only knew his brother had never returned. And his parents kept repeating to him, his older brother had fallen down the stairs, which was an accident that no one had expected. Living in this family, Richard was deeply influenced by his parents. He accepted the violence he suffered and returned it to the whole world. At the age of 10, Richard tortured and dismembered nearby cats and stray dogs, fantasizing about killing his father. In addition to his parents, Richard was also the target of bullying by problem teenagers due to his short stature. In 1948, after suffering a new round of bullying, Richard, in a fit of rage, grabbed a wooden stake from the roadside and began smashing it repeatedly against the boy who had bullied him, named Chase. Minutes later, Richard came to his senses, but Chase was already lying in a pool of blood. To prevent the police from identifying the body, Richard, only 13 years old, calmly pulled out Chase's teeth, chopped off his fingers with an axe, and then threw his body off a bridge. The murder plunged Richard into darkness. He chose to drop out of school and began to sustain himself through theft. Soon after, Richard established connections with the Gambino crime family. That's because Richard owed money to a member of this family named Roy. Since Richard did not repay the money on time, Roy sent people to beat him up. And then, Richard's physique and his tolerance for pain left a deep impression on Roy. At this point, Richard was no longer a frail young boy, but a fierce and burly man. He stood at 6 feet 5 inches tall and weighed nearly 300 pounds. Later, Richard paid off his money, and Roy considered Richard his partner in crime, putting him to work selling illegal pornographic materials, robbing and beating up those who had not repaid their money. Over time, Richard's ferocity, physique, and speed in handling difficult situations caught Roy's attention. Roy wanted Richard to help the crime family do more, but Richard didn't kill anyone. He could turn into a police informant in any time. So Roy took Richard to a street, randomly selected a passerby walking his dog, ordered Richard to take him out. Without questioning the order, Richard took the gun, walked up behind the passerby, shot him in the back of the head. After that, Richard not only became Roy's favorite executioner, but also a professional contract killer, working for crime families in New York City and New Jersey. Jersey City is located in the northeastern part of New Jersey, just a few minutes' drive from Manhattan, the heart of New York City. Since 1954, Richard began regularly traveling from Jersey City to New York City, constantly prowling the west side of Manhattan in search of victims. Richard usually works for criminal families, but he has one rule: he can kill men without hesitation, but he will not kill women or children. Later, Richard recalled, Once, when he was about to kill a man, the man gave up resisting and knelt down to pray to God. Because Richard's mother was Catholic, so he told the man, "You have 30 minutes to pray to God and see if he will come and save your life." But God never showed up and he never changed the circumstances, and that was that. It wasn't too nice. That's one thing. I shouldn't have done that one. I shouldn't have done it that way. It was one of the only times Richard ever expressed remorse for his actions. Richard's modus operandi was extremely varied. Shootings, stabbings, strangulations, poisonings, beatings, or various other weapons. It was said that his favorite was a nasal spray bottle filled with cyanide. Moreover, Richard would always ensure to remove the victim's fingers and teeth to prevent the police from identifying them. In 1961, an 18-year-old girl named Barbara graduated from high school and took a job as a secretary at a trucking company in New Jersey. At this time, 26-year-old Richard was already divorced. After meeting the charming Barbara, he began to pursue her relentlessly. On their first date, Richard brought Barbara flowers and gifts and invited her on a second date. Soon, the girl could see Richard waiting for her at the company entrance every evening after work and holding flowers in his hands. In September 1961, Richard and Barbara got married, but Barbara did not know. Richard had allegedly committed about 65 murders during this period. In 1970, they had already had 2 daughters and a son. In the eyes of neighbors, Richard was a rich businessman. Not only did he purchase a beautiful house with a swimming pool, but also sent all his children to expensive private schools. In everyone's eyes, Richard was more of a loving husband and caring father. He didn't drink excessively, didn't use drugs, didn't have relationships with other women, enjoyed spending quality time with his family, wrote poems for his daughter, and always took his family to Disneyland for fun. But these things only exist on the surface. Richard had hardly ever done any legitimate work. He simply earned enough money through crime to provide his family with a comfortable life. And in Barbara and the children's eyes, he was a typical two-faced person with 2 personalities. During the interview, Barbara said, "Everyone who had met Richard thought she was the luckiest person in the world, with weekly bouquets of flowers, new jewelry, and a $12,000 raccoon coat. But the truth was not so good." Although Richard always behaves well, he occasionally exhibits unpredictable angry outbursts. Before they were married, once, Barbara and Richard were sitting in the car. She told Richard she wanted to see other people. Hearing this, Richard flew into a rage. He stabbed her in the back with a hunting knife and told her she belonged only to him, threatened to kill her entire family, and then strangled her until she lost consciousness. In reality, Barbara married Richard not only because of his threats, and also because she believed she could change him. However, reality told her that Richard would not change. During their marriage, Richard broke her nose 3 times, and on one occasion, he even tried to run her over with his car. Richard also emotionally abused the children. For example, when his daughter came home late, Richard killed her dog in front of her. Although Richard never physically abused the children, it was not because he did not want to, but because Barbara threatened Richard that if he physically abused the children, she would kill him. For decades, Richard maintained the facade of a family man by completely compartmentalizing his life. He never disclosed any information about his personal life, family, or address to the criminals he worked with, nor did he engage in any social activities outside of work. However, as he grew older, Richard made a fatal mistake. He ran a burglary group, which was the key to his eventual arrest. In 1984, an informant told the police that one of the burglary group who frequently committed burglaries in northern New Jersey was named Richard. After investigation, the police discovered that Richard not only led a burglary group, but was also linked to 5 unsolved murder cases: George, Paul, Smith, Daniel, and Maskey, and 2 of whom were Richard's accomplices. Although Richard claimed to have committed over 200 murders in his lifetime, he was only convicted of these 5 murders. The first victim, 42-year-old George. On January 30th, 1980, Richard lured George into a transaction under the pretext of selling pornographic tapes. During the transaction, Richard murdered George. On February 5th, Richard found a 55-gallon steel drum. He severed the tendons in George's legs and forced George's body into the drum. To avoid suspicion, he discarded it near a chemical plant. The second victim, 51-year-old Paul. On April 29, 1982, Paul, a pharmacist, entered a store in Paterson, New Jersey. On the surface, it was an ordinary storefront, but hidden behind it was a room filled with various stolen goods for sale. Paul's goal was to purchase a stolen drug used to treat peptic ulcers, which he planned to resell through his own pharmacy to make a huge profit. Since Richard led a burglary group, Paul and Richard made an agreement. Paul was last seen on his way to meet Richard, carrying $25,000 in cash. Later, Richard confessed to killing Paul. He claimed that he lured Paul into a rented garage and attempted to shoot him with a gun, but because the gun jammed, he beat Paul to death with a crowbar. He then stuffed Paul's body into a 55-gallon steel drum and dumped it near a motel. The third victim, 37-year-old Smith, was one of Richard's accomplices. Due to frequent burglaries, Richard's group attracted the attention of the police. In December 1982, one of the group members, House, was arrested by the police. Police also issued 2 arrest warrants for the other 2 members, Smith and Daniel. In order to hide their tracks, Richard took Smith and Daniel to a motel, but Smith disobeyed Richard's orders and left the motel without permission to visit his daughter. This thing caused Richard to worry that Smith would become a police informant. After discussing it, Richard and several other members decided to kill Smith. Richard liked to kill people with poison. He mixed cyanide into a hamburger and fed it to Smith. However, worried that Smith would struggle when he realized he was about to die, so Daniel took a rope and strangled Smith to death. The fourth victim, Daniel, was one of Richard's accomplices. After killed Smith, Richard arranged for Daniel to move into an apartment in Bergenfield that belonged to his daughter's then-fiancé, Patterson. Between February and May 1983, Daniel was murdered by Richard, and the cause of his death remains unknown. Richard even asked Patterson to help him dispose of the body. He made up a story for Patterson, saying that someone had broken into the apartment over the weekend and killed Daniel. He added that to avoid trouble with the police, they should dispose of the body and forget about the whole thing. The fifth victim, 50-year-old Maskey. On September 25, 1983, Maskey's body was found in a town park in New York State, with a distinct bullet hole in the back of his head. The police investigation revealed that on July 1, 1981, Maskey had planned to meet Richard for a deal to purchase a large quantity of blank videotapes. That day, he drove a truck carrying $95,000 in cash to meet Richard. However, Maskey never appeared again after that day. During the autopsy, the coroner discovered that Maskey's body contained ice crystals. Moreover, Maskey's wife and son claimed that Maskey was still wearing the same clothes he had on when he disappeared. These details confirm that Richard had killed Maskey and frozen his body for over 2 years. As a result, Richard earned the notorious nickname, the Iceman. In order to arrest Richard and find evidence to convict him, the police formed a joint task force with other departments. In 1985, the police arrested Richard's old friend Phil, a member of a crime family. In order to avoid arrest, Phil chose to cooperate with the police and did his best to help Dominic, an undercover police officer, establish a close relationship with Richard. Later, Dominic disguised himself as a criminal and, through Phil's connections, purchased a handgun and silencer from Richard. During the transaction, Dominic also made a request. He wanted to hire Richard to murder a wealthy Jewish cocaine dealer. Richard asked Dominic if he could provide some pure cyanide, as he preferred poison because it wouldn't make the situation worse. Richard boasted that he had killed someone by smearing cyanide on a hamburger and planned to kill a few rats, which were Richard's other 2 accomplices. On December 17, 1986, Richard found Dominic and obtained the cyanide used for the murder, but Richard still had doubts about this client. So, after obtaining the cyanide, Richard first smeared it on a hamburger and lured a stray dog to eat it. When he found that the cyanide did not kill the stray dog, Richard chose to go home and decided not to carry out the murder plan. However, the police discovered that the plan had been exposed. They set up roadblocks and successfully arrested Richard. During the arrest, Barbara repeatedly interfered with the police's arrest operation. So, because there was a gun in Richard's car, the police charged Barbara with gun possession as punishment. Later, prosecutors charged Richard with 5 counts of murder, 6 counts of weapons violations, attempted murder, robbery, and attempted robbery. At the press conference, the New Jersey Attorney General described Richard's motive for murder as profit, pointing out that Richard had conducted business transactions with others, and ultimately they disappeared. The money ended up in Richard's hands. During the trial, Richard's two accomplices, House and Deppner, whom he had intended to kill, as well as Dominic, provided evidence that was unfavorable to Richard. In March 1988, the jury found Richard guilty of murdering Smith and Daniel, but since his actions were not deemed to have directly caused the victims' deaths, Richard was sentenced to a minimum of 60 years in prison. After the trial, Richard confessed to killing Masquet and George, and was sentenced to 2 additional life sentences. Moreover, Richard also confessed to killing Paul, but the police decided not to prosecute because their case was weak, and an additional life sentence would not have any impact on Richard's sentence. In October 2005, after spending nearly 8 years in prison, Richard was diagnosed with Kawasaki disease. This rare condition primarily affects the blood vessels and can lead to serious heart problems. Then, Richard was transferred to a secure ward at St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton to receive treatment. Richard had explicitly requested that doctors perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation in the event of cardiac arrest. However, his ex-wife Barbara signed a do not resuscitate order. The week before Richard died, the hospital contacted Barbara to ask if she would revoke the directive, but she refused. On March 5, 2006, Richard died of cardiac arrest. In 2008, Barbara said in a media interview that Richard's obsession with her was almost insane, and even his last words before he died were an expression of his love for her. Barbara said that he kept telling me he loved me, and I just replied, me too, but in fact I never loved him and never told him I loved him. When asked what she thought after Richard passed away, she said, "I regret not telling him what a bastard he was, how much I hated him, and I wish the last words he heard were how deeply I hated him."